Good evening, all, and welcome to this joint Teagasc ICBF Beef Indexes webinar. By way of introduction, my name is Pat Mulvihill, and I am your chair for this evening's meeting. What has been presented here tonight is the culmination of 2 years of research between ICBF and Teagasc on the improvements needed to future-proof the beef terminal index and the beef replacement index. Times are changing, and our breeding programs cannot be left behind as we battle to make beef production more economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable. Breeding, of course, is the cornerstone of performance, and a good deal of research is being presented here tonight. Simply relates to updating the costs of production and the product prices in line with market trends. The scientific principles applied in developing these indexes are the same as those used globally, including in our own dairy EDI and dairy beef DBI indexes. The research you will hear tonight has been approved by the ICBF Technical Advisory Group, which includes international geneticists from a range of different species. More recently, the project team has engaged with an industry-facing focus group, including farmers, on how best to deploy this state-of-the-art technology. The indexes rank animals based on expected profit of their progeny, depending on if destined directly for slaughter or to be kept as replacements. And while the indexes operate across breeds, one has to appreciate that people have their own preferences for individual breeds, but the indexes work equally well within and across breeds. And as you'll see later on tonight, there's a good scattering of breeds ranking highly on the top lists of sires. The format or running order for this evening's meeting is as follows. The 4 speakers will make their presentations, and this will be followed by the question and answer session. Members of the audience are invited to submit questions by tapping on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and type in the question. I will remind the audience again at the end of each presentation. One point to note here is that the webinar software has a capacity to handle up to 1,000 participants. On the issue of questions raised, in the event that all questions are not dealt with because of time constraints, a follow-up exercise will be completed to answer outstanding questions, and these will be circulated to the participants. And now to get on to the business of presentations. As you can see here on the slide, we have 4 speakers. The first presentation will deal with the motivation for change and presented by Margaret Kelleher from ICBF. The second presentation will be by Donna Berry, detailing the improvements to the terminal index. Paul Crossan, Teagasc Grange, will deal with the replacement index improvements. And finally, Siobhan Ring from ICBF will outline the impact of these improvements. So without further ado, I would hand you over now to Margaret Kelleher to make our presentation.
Thanks, Pat, and thanks for everyone for joining tonight. I hope you can hear me okay. So I'm going to kick off the session here, just to give a background on, well, what is the motivation for the changes that are coming? So the big question out there now, I imagine, is, well, why? Why now, and why are you bringing in these changes? And I think a good place to start would be to just have a look at, well, where are we now, and how did we get there, and what were the changes along the way to get us to this point? So I have a graph here, and I'm not going to present too many graphs, but just to bear with me on this one, this is a graph showing the terminal index and replacement index genetic trends over the last 22 years. So we have here the first calving suckler beef females, the year of calving there, tracking along from 2000 to 2022, and the profit per progeny there and the euro values there on the left. So, you know, you want to see that the genetic trend is going in the right direction, and that would be to produce more profitable progeny on the ground. So the lines should be both increasing. So if we just look over time, that wasn't always the case. So we can see there in the early 2000s, you know, the terminal index, we were doing very well, it was increasing. However, the maternal traits, not so much. So the replacement index was actually slightly on the decline. So in 2007, we saw the first introduction of the suckler cow welfare scheme, and this resulted in many of you then going out and recording your sires. And what that meant was that we had a lot more information in our genetic evaluations. So we had much faster genetic gain based on this. So you know the sire and you know a bit more about the background pedigree, so we can make faster genetic gain and better breeding decisions. And that was on the terminal side. So you might notice there that after that little black dotted line there where the suckler scheme came in, you can see the blue line tracking up a bit faster, which was a good improvement. That led then to the introduction of the replacement index there in 2011. And this was really to deal with the fact that we knew that the maternal traits were on the decline, and we had to come up with some sort of index by way of improving that. So that's where we established the replacement index in 2011. And we do see then from that point on, there was a shift. But most notably really is the BGP. When this scheme came in 2015, there was a huge change in how everyone was recording their data and how we got information in and how the evaluations were run. So, you know, the use of genomics was absolutely critical in the turning point of these genetic trends. So having, you know, more genetic information along with all your other phenotypic records on the ground, we knew far more about your animals to produce much stronger and reliable proofs for you in the terminal and replacement indexes. So just to kind of give you a snapshot of what that means from the database perspective, back in the early 2000s, the sire recording level was only around 15% per year. And the evaluations, you had about 2,000 carcass records. And now today we're in a really, really strong position where year on year, we're seeing sire recording coming in at around 80%. So over 7 million, nearly 7 million carcass records going through an evaluation. And we now have 2 million genotypes. So loads of information to make these indexes more robust and reliable for the suckler industry. So, you know, where we are now in terms of terminal replacement index, on this graph here, we can see that the terminal index in 2022 was sitting around 71 euros and the replacement index at 88. So if we look at just maybe the last couple of years since BGP, that rate of genetic gain is €2 per year. So that's actually, you know, the gain that we're getting in the suckler herd is actually on par with what we're seeing on the dairy herd, which is, you know, a massive turn in the tide in terms of genetic improvement. So, you know, it then lines up quite nicely here with a Board BIA report where they did a review and found that in the last 10 years, there's been a beef output increase of around 21%. So, you know, all these improvements, you know, contribute, you know, to the industry at large and could continue to grow at this level of genetic gain. So both indexes, the terminal replacement, selecting for more profitable and efficient animals for the beef farmers. So then, if that is the case, you know, back to that question of why are we making any changes? So I don't think anyone can dispute this. When you think about the terminal and replacement indexes that we have, there's been absolutely no changes to them since the schemes came in with BGP to safeguard them, let the schemes run. So we have now a case where the market prices, so the economic values, which you're going to hear a bit about from Donna and Paul later, have been untouched. And we all know in 8 years, there has been massive changes in the revenues that we're getting in terms of beef, and then of course the ever increasing cost of production. So it's a much different landscape than it was 8 years ago. So that is the first major change in these terminal and replacement indexes, is that we had to come in and have those updated. So why would we make any other changes? Well, always is the case is that if we find that there is a trait of importance to the industry, or we have a new method in the ways that we run our evaluations, or a new technology, it is the case that we would want to implement it into an index if it was going to provide better results in terms of proofs, better reliability. One notable example of that would be, when genomics was actually launched in 2009, this was adopted and has changed the rate of genetic gain that we've seen across all sectors. And I suppose one of the key ones that's forefront of many people's minds now is what we have to do in terms of policy change. And there's been a lot of interest and details about this in the media, and it's one that we just can't ignore. There is a lot coming down the line in terms of policy change, and it's all to do with the climate targets that have been set. So just to give you a snapshot there, you'd be all very familiar with how agriculture has been highlighted as a key contributor to the greenhouse gases, so over 35% of greenhouse gases in Ireland coming from Ireland. It's quite frustrating when you think of what agriculture is achieving out there in terms of the output and how much we export. But unfortunately, carbon from a government policy point of view is measured as a gross output and not on a kilo basis. So the Climate Action Plan has been set. It's legally binding, and as a whole in Ireland, we have to reduce our greenhouse gases by 51% by 2030 and be net zero by 2050. Agriculture has been targeted because of its higher contribution. However, I would highlight that when we take into consideration all other industries, we're all in the same boat. We're all trying to do something to change it, to reduce our output. So if we just have a quick look here from the Irish Times, a recent article showing us that we're not alone in terms of our struggles, in terms of trying to reduce our greenhouse gases. You can see here there's electricity, transport, industry, and agriculture here down here, kind of in the middle of it all. The starting basis there, shows that agriculture, unfortunately, there is the highest contributor. Our target has been set to reduce that by 25%. And the EPA is predicting that we're only going to meet 19%. So we are way off in terms of what they consider what we can achieve. What can genetics do to contribute to this? I mean, there's a lot of other things outside of genetics that people are doing. Different methods in terms of slurry spreading, incorporating clover, other measures have been incorporated. But, we have had extensive research into this, and it has been shown that genetics, by incorporating carbon into our breeding objectives, we could actually contribute to reducing our overall target of 25% by 20%. So it is something that we can't ignore, and it's coming fast down the line, and we're talking about 2030. So breeding, as you know, takes a long time to bed in. So we have to be seen to be doing something in that line as well. So just in terms of the research, I mean, this research has been ongoing for over 2 years, I suppose you could say. There's been a lot of work between Teagasc, ICBF, and external parties in terms of the research, and there's been published papers in those sectors. A lot of these, the results of this research has been shown at Teagasc conferences. There has been pre-SCEP meetings, quarterly meetings, and working group meetings all through the 2 years on this. And then, of course, we have this technical advisory group. So it's a tag we refer to it as. They meet us every 3 or 4 months, and they go through every single item that we want to bring into an evaluation or an index and review every point of it from a technical perspective. So in doing that, for every change that you're going to see this evening, that will be spoken about by the next few speakers, the technical advisory group have gone through this, and the final approval was given on the 27th of July. So just to give you a bit of a timeline on that. Beef focus group was set up as well in terms of a communication and rollout. So we met with them on the 20th of July, and in that meeting, it was an intense meeting in terms of trying to get them up to date on all the different changes that were coming in. And it was on the 9th of October, so fairly recently there, that we actually met again, and that was to go through what should be the proposed rollout plan, communication, what do people want to see in their catalogues and reports and screens. At the same time, I suppose there's kind of a bit of an overlap of some of these points here, but we had from the technical advisory group agreeing all the changes on the 27th of July, that allowed us then to actually do a test run of the changes in terms of the evaluations themselves. So evaluations take us 2 months to run from start to finish. So when we got that clearance at the end of July, it was not until the end of September that we were able to see what, when we bring in all these changes, what did they actually look like. So those test proofs were developed around that time, and we had about a 2-week period there of industry consultation with reviewing these test proofs and some farmer feedback. So we did get feedback, and there was a few changes to what we were proposing, and at the end of the day, it was the ICBF board then that got the final say on whether or not this was the way we should go. So that happened on the 19th of October, and those changes were approved. So that's where we are up to now. I suppose the next 2 points I have are on the information campaign. So from the beef focus group that we met on the 9th of October, we got loads of different recommendations in terms of how do we get this information out. The first one being a webinar, so that's us here tonight. And there's many other things planned there, as you can see in the list. So the planned launch of where you're going to see these changes will be actually at the Teagasc Beef Conference there in November 21st. And at the same time, we're actually publishing the proofs. So at the moment, those evaluations are being developed and in line for production at that time. So by ways of just taking a few take-home messages from why we made some changes, just the first point is that we have shown over the years, BGP being a great example of it, genetics has been a trusted and proven technology to deliver. We can make gains in profitability, sustainability for the suckler herd, and now we also need to do it for the climate and environment. In terms of market prices, as I mentioned earlier, these hadn't been updated in 8 years, and we all know that those prices are quite different to what they were 8 years ago. So that is one of the key changes in what you're going to see later. In terms of new improvements, in terms of new traits, it gives farmers more choice in their breeding decisions. So some, within an index, you have a number of traits. Some are more important to some other farmers, and you can make those choices yourself. So the choice is with the farmer. And then lastly, I suppose, just the potential of genetics to deliver so much on the carbon front. 1.2 megatons of greenhouse gas mitigation from that overall figure of 5.75 for the agriculture industry. It's a massive contribution. It's over 20% of what we're meant to reduce by, and that's by a breeding decision only. Once you make that breeding decision, that will carry on in future generations. So definitely a technology that should be used to our advantage to meet those targets. So I'll sign off here just to summarize, to say that the motivation for the change is to improve the beef breeding indexes to better align with the needs of the suckler industry today and safeguard into the future.
Thank you, Margaret, for a very comprehensive presentation. And before moving on, I just want to remind you, the participants, to record any questions that you might wish to raise. Next up is Donna Berry to outline the improvements to the terminal index. Over to you, Donna.
Okay, thanks, Pat. And before I get into the details of the terminal index, maybe it's an opportune time just to take a step back and see what is the terminal index. Well, it's an index that ranks beef bulls both within and across breed, where all the progeny are directly slaughtered. So Paul is going to talk about the replacement index after this. That's for beef bulls and cows where the progeny are destined to remain within the herd. So it's a euro-based index, and just as an example, 2 bulls with 10 euros difference in their terminal index, they're expected to have progeny who on average have a difference of 10 euros in their profit. The index, it works across breeds. We're pretty unique globally in that, but also, of course, it can work within breed. And Pat, you alluded to that earlier on. Some people have particular breed preferences, and that's fine. The index also enables you to identify which are the genetically superior animals within each of those breeds. And actually, the terminal index, they're used across the country, across the world. Like they're called different things. So In American Angus, for example, they have the feedlot value and the beef value. In Australia, they have the Wheeler Index or the Northern Export Index. And in France, they have the ICBF Index. So this isn't different to what other people are doing. But the traits and the emphasis does differ a little bit across the different countries. So what I'm going to talk about is these 5 main points just for 6 or 7 minutes. These are our improvements to the terminal index. Paul, as I said, will talk about the replacement index after this. So the first one is the updating of the costs of production. Like these values or these emphases that we put on the traits, they're not just magicked up. They're based on the costs and the prices. And as Mag said, we haven't updated those since 2015. So it's an opportune time to update those. I'll talk about that later on. Breeding, as you well know, is a long-term game. And what we need to do from a breeding perspective is we need to future-proof our indexes. So we need to be proactive as opposed to reactive. And that's particularly important when we talk about carbon and the environmental in general. The next one, I'll describe this in a little bit more detail, but this is just feedback we were getting the whole time from farmers was the benefit of going from an okay docility animal to an easy docility animal or very docile wasn't that much, but what we really didn't want is those extremely aggressive animals. So farmers wanted to penalize those a little bit more because they didn't want those. They didn't want to use bulls or cows that were producing those type of animals. Like every other index in the world, constantly looking at new traits that affect profitability. You know, it's been in the media a lot over the past few months. Age at slaughter, what people are calling, or age at finish. You know, if the Food Vision is saying we need to reduce our age at slaughter by 3 months by 2030. So again, how do we do that? Well, we can do it through management for sure, but we can also do it through breeding. Tuberculosis also all over the journal these days. We seem to be increasing in our incidence. Huge issue. And then finally, the carcass specs, just to align our breeding policy more in line with the market demands. And then the fifth one, which I'll talk about in more detail, is the whole issue of carcass fat. Again, feedback was that we should not remove carcass fat, but we should modify the way that we put it into the index. So if we just take each of those individually, so again, updating the costs of production, and you'll see in my last slide, you know, I think there's around 10 or 12 traits inside the terminal index. Let's just focus on calving difficulty as an example of how do we come up with these weights on calving difficulty. So there's 3 main costs to calving difficulty. You know this better than I do. Labor. So again, we're surveying farmers as how long do you spend on a cow with a cesarean? And like you might think it's 2 hours or 3 hours, but there's the after treatment. If it's a downer cow, it's getting that up, it's getting the calf to suck. Maybe you're going to have to tube the calf. So these all things take time, and there's a cost associated with that. The cost we put into for vets is actually taken from a recent survey from the Farmers Journal. That was easy. And then, of course, this calving difficulty affects subsequent performance, fertility, survival, death even of the cow. So, for example, we got all this information from the database. So, as an example, a cesarean, on average, extends calving interval by 38 days. There's a cost to that. Also, relative to animals who don't experience any calving difficulty, 31% of cows that have a cesarean don't make it to the next lactation. So again, there's a cost associated with that. When you culminate them all together, you get the cost and the emphasis on calving difficulty. The next one is the issue of carbon. And again, look, I don't need to be telling you about this. It's all over the media. And maybe not so much is this whole term, but we will hear more about it, is these sustainable food systems. Everybody's talking about the bottom right, which is the environmental sustainability, and that's fine. But we also need economic sustainability and social sustainability. Now, I would argue in the terminal index heretofore, we have been pretty well addressing economic sustainability and social sustainability, you know, like docility, calving difficulty, calf deaths, etc. That's social sustainability. So from an environmental sustainability, in tandem with what we did in the dairy and the dairy beef last year, we've introduced a carbon subindex just with 6% emphasis. The only traits it's applied to is gestation length, feed intake, and age at slaughter. Just think about it. Longer age at slaughter, all else being equal, has a carbon cost. And we have to future-proof this index. The next one is docility, this non-linear effect. So what I'm showing you here in the vertical is the impact. It gets worse as you go higher. And then I got 2 example bulls there. I got a really quiet bull on the right and a really aggressive bull on the left. And as I said, the feedback I was really getting was there's no difference between an average docility animal and a really quiet one, right? But what you really don't want is the wicked one. So the emphasis that is put in docility within the index is really just to penalize the extremely aggressive animals. It actually doesn't affect many animals at all, but what it avoids is really temperamental animals coming high up in a terminal index. The next one is new traits, and if you think about it, the age at finish, this is providing the breeding tools to enable us to hit these carbon targets of a 3-month reduction in age at slaughter by the year 2030 and beyond, because remember, as Mag says, this is cumulative and permanent. 35% of the differences in age at slaughter is actually genetic, and that's within breed. We know that there is also variability across breeds. Tuberculosis, 14% of it is genetic. If you have a herd, all herd doesn't go down in TB. Only a proportion of them actually go down. And if you follow it, it's actually often same family lines that are going down across the national herd. And then finally is the carcass specifications, and more aligning with the market signal. So what I'm talking about here is minimum conformation, penalizing animals or bulls that produce animals that are poor conformation, minimum carcass weight and maximum carcass weight, and minimum fat and maximum fat cover as well, in line with the grid. And that kind of links up to my last one, which is the way that we have just slightly modified how we include fat in the terminal index. Heretofore, it was a kind of what we call a linear response, because for the same carcass weight, the more fat, the less meat. But now we've just changed that slightly to still fat is important, but just once they hit the minimum carcass fat, then you're okay, but you actually also don't want them to go over fat, because that's also a cost on the system. So Pat, just to finish up, what I'm showing you here is the relative emphasis on the current index. That's currently the terminal index on the left, and on the right is the improved index. So just look at the left-hand side. What we see here is exactly actually a 50% emphasis on the carcass traits and a 50% emphasis, you can see, on the cost traits. So half and half. If you go to the right-hand side, very little changes, to be honest, in the terminal index. Now you have 47% emphasis on the carcass, but actually, if you look at slaughter age at slaughter, that's 7% as well. So you could argue there's more than half the emphasis really on the slaughter traits, and then half of the emphasis on the cost of production traits. So it's great to have good revenue, big animals with good conformation, but if that's coming at a cost of calving difficulty, gestation length, dead calves, etc., greater feed intake, that's a cost in the system, and that's eroding the profit. So Pat, just to finish, these are the traits in this table that are in the terminal index. I'm just showing you the direction that's more favorable based on the index. This is what the economics is telling us. Top 3, we want them, or top 4, less. So you want less calving difficulty, less calf mortality, shorter gestation, less feed intake. You want heavier and more conformed carcasses, for sure. So that's the emphasis that's on that, and it's generating those type of animals. And then you have some of the other traits like intermediate fat cover. Because we have genotypes of these animals, we know if the animal is going to be polled or not. So there's a benefit of the animal being polled. And then earlier finish. And then just if you look on the right-hand side, this is what it's doing. It's driving up the revenue and at the same time minimizing the costs. So that's it, Pat. You're on mute, Pat.
Almost, yeah. Sorry. Thanks again, Donna, for a very comprehensive presentation. And again, a reminder to our audience to record any questions they may wish to raise on the question and answers at the bottom of the screen. Now, on to our next, and I'm calling on Paul Crossan to update us on the improvements to the replacement index.
Okay, thank you, Pat, and good evening, everyone. So Donna has covered the terminal index, and now I'm going to look at the replacement index. And I suppose more specifically, I'm going to look at the cow traits within the replacement index. So as Donna mentioned, the replacement index is an index to select your next generation of suckler cows. There are 2 components to that. The cow traits, in other words, the traits of the cow herself, and also the calf traits, in other words, the traits of the calf produced from that cow. Donna has covered the calf traits because effectively they are the terminal traits. So now I'm going to look at the cow traits. Okay, so the question is, what are our main objectives in terms of developing the new economic values or the updated economic values for the cow traits. The first objective is to reduce the cost of carrying suckler cows. And I just pulled down some numbers from the Teagasc National Farm Survey in terms of the total cost per cow unit for suckling farms. I compared the last time we updated the economic values with the most recent Teagasc National Farm Survey data. And we all know that costs have increased quite substantially. Prices have increased in that time period. But when you look at the numbers, it's actually quite staggering. We've gone from almost €1,100, 1094 per cow unit, to almost €1,550. So a greater than 40% increase in cost per suckler cow. So we really need to aggressively chase cost reductions within the suckler herd. Of course, there are management aspects to that, how you manage your pasture, how you manage your feed, and so on. But genetics is also one really important component of that. And there are two aspects to that. Firstly, cow size. So all other things being equal, larger cows consume more feed. Feed is approximately 75% of our total costs. Therefore, we need to chase feed costs in particular. The second aspect of this, and it's also related to feed costs, is fertility. Where you have impaired fertility, cows calve later, for example, in a spring calving herd, cows calve later in the spring. Those cows that calve later tend to be indoor for longer on grass silage rather than outside on grazed pasture. So in a more expensive feeding period compared to their comrades who are out grazing. Of course, we also want to increase the value of output. Two components to that, live weight performance. In other words, we want to have heavier live weight. We want to achieve that live weight faster. But it's essentially a balance. We don't want to achieve that at high cost. So we can get high live weight output, and we can select high carcass weight sires and so on. But we want to balance that with issues like calving difficulty, feed intake, and so on. So we want to get the optimal balance. So it's not maximizing output, it's optimizing output within the system. Again, fertility is also key for output. So if you look at a trait like calving interval, I'll come to it in a moment, where you have longer calving intervals, for example, 390 days on national average, your number of calves produced per year is obviously less than 1. Therefore, you don't have a full weanling per year on average. Also, if you look at traits like age at first calving or survival, for example, age at first calving, where you have longer, older ages at calving, the cost of producing that heifer is greater than the heifer that calves at a younger age. And for survival, of course, the number of replacements we have will increase the cost within the herd per cow. So fertility is important for the value of output in addition to the live weight component. We also want to further reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This has already been well covered by Margaret and Donna, that we do want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We have a societal obligation to that. There is an economic cost to it, and there's also an environmental aspect to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Indeed, it's the main function. We want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to meet our legislative obligation, but we also see the effect of climate change every day, no more so than this past week. So we do have obligations around this. So how do we deal with carbon? It's already been deployed in the EBI and the DBI, and Donna mentioned that in the last set of slides. So we deploy it in terms of the absolute carbon emissions. So it's more than just methane. And the right-hand pie chart there looks at the breakdown of sources of emissions from a typical suckler to beef system. So enteric methane is the largest component, and that's why we focused on that predominantly. But there are also other components in respect of greenhouse gas emissions. Fertilizer application, fertilizer production, nitrogen and nitrate-based emissions. So we look at the full life cycle on the farm and the various sources of emissions from that. We use prediction equations for methane. We do have a framework within the model to deploy the methane breeding values that are currently being developed. Many of you will have seen those published in April. We don't use them in the current evaluation, but we do have a framework when we have a full life cycle breeding value to plug and play, if you like, those into the indexes. We assume a carbon price of €80 a tonne. So just take an example of age at first calving within the cow traits. All else being equal, where you calve earlier, you have less carbon until that day of calving. You also have lower costs, of course. So the economic value here in euros per day is €1.76. So each day younger calving for the first time saved €1.76. You also save 1.4 kilos of carbon, or if you have 1 day older, you gain 1.4 kilos, so you generate an additional 1.4 kilos of carbon. So what we do there is multiply that by the carbon price of €80 a tonne, which gives us a carbon economic value of minus 11 cents. And our total economic value, and we do this for essentially all of the traits with the exception of 1 or 2, we combine our carbon economic value with our production economic value, which is essentially our conventional system, and the combined value in this case is minus 187. Okay, so reducing costs, and firstly looking at feed. So if we look at feed costs, 3 components to feed costs: grazed pasture, 9.3 cents a kilo, so about €93 per tonne. Grass silage, 20.8 cents per kilo. These are on a dry matter basis, so €208 per tonne of dry matter. And concentrates, 38 cents per kilo, so €380 per tonne for concentrates. Across the system per cow unit, we're consuming, or the system is consuming 4.6 tonnes of grazed pasture, 1.7 tonnes of silage, and about 0.4 tonnes, 400 kilos of concentrate. So that's 68% of grazed, 26% ensiled and fed from silage, and 6% concentrates. So your average cost of feeding, if you apply the proportion for the cow herd and the calf to finish system, is 13 cents a kilo for the cow herd and 18 cents a kilo for the calf to finish system. So important components of that: cow size, I mentioned already, really important here. Intake breeding value, so essentially what is the potential of the animal to consume feed. And the fertility components, again, are important here, in the sense that where you have earlier calving, you get access to pasture earlier in the year, and your average cost is lower. So if we look at that within the context of the fertility components, and there are 3 components to this: the gestation length, calving interval, and survival. Look at our cow-calf system, calving in around the middle of March. Post-calving, you turn out to pasture, so you get about 50% grass silage, 50% pasture roughly in March. Cow and calf at grass for the grazing season, housed at the end of October, 331 kilos weaning weight, and the animal goes on to a silage-based diet. Where you have longer calving intervals, you shift this arrow to the right-hand side. You end up with more silage in the system, less grazed pasture. If we look at the second part of the farm system, the yearling phase, turned out mid-March, early to mid-March, full grazing season, heifers finished 60 days inside, finished at 311 kilos at 19 months. Steers go inside for a finishing period and finished at 22 months, 390 kilos. So survival is important here in the context that you have fewer heifers available for finishing where you have poor survival. You need more heifers as replacements. So again, fertility important in the context of cost in addition to output. So reducing costs, age at first calving. In this case, if we look at a comparison of 24 and 36 months of age for first calving, and these are the actual national statistics for age at first calving for 2021. And if we look at the national statistics, we actually calve the highest proportion as a single group of our cow herd at less than 26 months of age, 34%. 31% calve at over 34 months of age, so effectively 3-year-old calving. So what we see happening here is a classical pattern. Heifers bred to calve at 2 years of age. Some miss that window, if you like, in a spring calving system. The next calving season is the following spring, so those heifers are carried over and you see a secondary peak. So we have 2 peaks, one at 24 months, roughly approximately 24 months, and one at approximately 3 years of age. And of course, we get some that slip from autumn to spring and spring to autumn and calve at 30 months of age. The second thing we will see here is if we break that down by breed type and look at a comparison of cows calving or heifers calving for the first time at 2 years of age the green bar, or at greater than 32 months. So we'll say approximating 3 years of age, so that orange bar. We can see that regardless of breed type, we have cows calving in those 2 periods. So we have a proportion of our late maturing breeds as well as our early maturing breeds calving at 2 years of age. Of course, output, as I mentioned at the outset, really important here as well. Ultimately, we are producing beef, and revenue is the critical driver of profitability within the system. So we have to achieve high levels of revenue in a cost-efficient manner. 3 components to this again: live weight performance, and the economic value here is essentially the cost or the price we receive for beef carcass. And in this analysis, we've assumed €4.68. There's also the effect of the cow in driving live weight in the weanling. In other words, the milk effect. We know that a milky cow is important in suckling systems, and therefore the milk effect is important in maximizing weaning weight. We also have to consider the cost of milk. So there is a point beyond which we don't want more milk. Obviously, we want enough milk, but we don't want too much. There is a cost to that. And secondly, there is a cost to that heavier weaning that we have to factor into it. So weaning weight is important, and it is a positive, but we mediate that by some costs that come off that. Fertility, I mentioned this again in one of the earlier slides. And just to take one example, if we take a national average calving interval, the most recently published data of 390 days. So take your example of a 300 kilo weanling. That weanling, if you express it on a per year basis, because that cow doesn't calve again for 390 days after that weanling is born. So it's over a year. So express it on a yearly basis. Then your weaned output per year is actually 280 kilos. So that's a loss of €65 per weanling because of impaired or poor reproductive performance. So fertility is actually really important in the context of increasing output. Okay, so putting all that together, if we look at the economic values and compare it with the current, so the current versus the new, we can see in terms of feed costs, a really substantial increase in feed costs. So very negative, and particularly for progeny becoming more negative. And we see that every day. You know that better than I do. The cost of feed has increased. The cost of fertilizer, the cost of concentrate feed, the cost of fuel, contracting, and so on. So feed costs increase very substantially, and they need to be reflected. Again, fertility, gestation length becoming more important. In other words, the cost of longer gestation, the cost of longer calving intervals, and some of this is again related to feed costs, and some of this is related to lower output. Survival, again, it's important. It's negative, not as negative as it was previously. And what we're seeing here is the gap between prime beef and cull beef narrowed somewhat since the last time the economic values were looked at. But still, it's a negative economic value. So it is important to improve survival in the system. And calving age, slightly more negative. Somewhat similar, but slightly more negative. On the sales side, so our output traits, all very positive. Particularly, obviously, our carcass weight traits. So our genetic potential of our progeny to gain live weight is particularly important, as you can see here, and more important than it was previously, where we've seen the increase in beef price coming through. Equally, on the cull side, heavier culls. So again, within the full composite index, we're trying to balance a number of different traits. So we want to balance the cost of feed to feed the cow with the cull value of the cow. So both of them are expressed. And weaning weight. So the effect of milk, if you like, and the capacity of a cow's milk yield to drive weaning weight. Slightly less or somewhat less than it was previously, but still a really important trait in terms of driving output. Okay, final slide, just looking at the relative emphasis and comparing the current with the new. So as I mentioned at the outset, we have cow traits and calf traits. So the cow traits in green. So the traits expressed by the female progeny as a suckler cow. And the brown traits are the calf traits. So the traits expressed by a calf of that suckler cow. And we can see if we compare the current with the new, fertility slightly lower in terms of relative emphasis, milk slightly lower again, 14 to 11%, calving traits 4 to 3%, cull value 7 to 6%, live weight 14 to 11%, and docility 4 to 3%. So all of them falling slightly. And essentially what's happening here is we have two new traits, or two new components in terms of the relative emphasis. We have TB, which Donna has mentioned already, and carbon. So that 10% of the new traits squeezing out to some extent some piece of each of these other traits. Equally on the calf side, beef merit similar, calving similar, gestation similar, as Donna mentioned. On the terminal side, a number of we're seeing modest enough changes on the terminal side. Feed slightly lower, mortality similar, and we're squeezing in the carbon now at about 2% emphasis, and age at finish 3% emphasis coming in there, and that's squeezing out some of the emphasis on the cow side. So Pat, that completes the overview of the improvements to the replacement index and the cow traits, and I'll hand it back to you now.
Again, thank you very much, Paul. And again, a reminder to the audience to record any questions they may have in relation to Paul's presentation. And we move on now to our final speaker of the evening, Siobhan Ring, who is going to discuss the impact of the changes with you here this evening. Thank you, Siobhan.
Might need to confirm, Pat, you can see that, okay? Okay. So good evening, everyone. So look, we've heard a lot tonight about, I suppose, the reasoning behind the changes, but let's see, I suppose, what impact this is having on farm. So over the next 10 minutes, we'll start off with the terminal index, and then we'll take a look at the replacement index. So to start off, for the terminal index, here I simply have a continuum of where cattle lie on the terminal index, and I've just simply broken that down by breed. So I've highlighted where the mean of each breed lies on the terminal index. So as you'll be familiar with, the current most desirable terminal breeds are the Continentals. So we've got the Blues, the Charleys, and the Limousines here highlighted in yellow. If we look at the improved terminal index, what we'll see here in green is that it's those same Continental breeds that are most desirable after the changes. So it's worth noting here, I suppose, that the differential between these breeds is now less with these improvements. So some of these breed averages are coming closer together. However, I'm only showing you breed averages, and like everything, Donald have mentioned it earlier, and Paul, there's huge variation within each individual breed, and some breeds will overlap on terminal index. And this means, I suppose, that there's huge opportunity or scope for improvement within each of the individual breeds. So if we take a look at the breed composition, I suppose, of AI bulls, which would currently rank in the top 100 on the active bulls based on the terminal index. So within that, within those top 100 bulls, it is those Continental breeds that I showed you a minute ago, the breeds of Limousine, Charleys, and Blues, which dominate the list currently. When we look at the improved list, again, of the same top 100 AI bulls, of which are available today, that breed composition is very similar, still dominated by the Charleys, Limousines, and the Blues. And one thing I suppose to note here, which is important, that this is a reflection of the bulls that are available today, so it's a certain point in time. And this is a list, I suppose, that could look very different, I suppose, next year, 2 years' time, once individual breeds, I suppose, have got to grips with these changes, because I suppose there's much room for improvement within each individual breed. And within each breed, whichever is your preference, there are still lots of bulls that will be 4- and 5-star within each individual breed. So where does this take the direction of finishing cattle? So the key message from this is that irrespective of your breed of choice, these improvements should benefit all breeds, and it should result in easier calvings, shorter gestations, less calf mortality, as well as heavier, more conformed carcasses, which will finish at an earlier age. And as well as that, they'll require less feed to do that, and they will have a better genetic resistance to bovine tuberculosis. Moving on then to the replacement index. So again, here I have just the continuum of where cattle lie on the replacement index. And again, I've just broken this down by breed. So, and I've highlighted, I suppose, where the mean of each breed lies currently on the replacement index here in blue. And as you're familiar with, the current most desirable breeds on the replacement index are Angus, Limousin, and Simmental. When we look at the improved index, which is this line here in green, it's those same three breeds, so Limousin, Simmental, and Angus, that remain top of the replacement index. Another thing to note is that the traditional breeds for the likes of the Angus and the Herefords, they have improved in their replacement index value. The breed that has moved the most is the Belgian Blues when it comes to the replacement index. Looking then again just at the top 100 bulls, 100 AI bulls currently active and available in AI, and we just look at that on the replacement index and we compare the current list to the improved list. What you'll see when comparing the current to the improved list is you'll see that there's still a wide range of breeds available. So a total of 7 breeds available within that improved list. And I suppose absolutely, you'll see here that there are more of the traditional breeds there, the likes of the Angus and the Hereford on that list. But as I said earlier, within each individual breed of whatever your preference may be, there are still bulls there that are 4 and 5 stars. And I suppose there's plenty of scope for improvement within each individual breed. So in a few years' time, even next year, you know, this list could look very different in terms of, you know, the breeds that would be top of this list. So I suppose the question that comes in often, you know, when we were kind of, you know, talking about these changes is, okay, well, so what will the impact be on the suckler herd? So what I've done here is we take a look at, you know, 5-star cows. What will they look like in the improved index? So I've just broken up the origin of all the cows currently in SCEP by whether they originated from the dairy herd or whether they were suckler bred, continental or traditional, and then checked, I suppose, what they were sired by. So this chart just gives the proportion of dairy bred cows, continental cows and traditional cows. And what you'll see here is if you look at these individual proportions is that I suppose the improved index is now going to contain more suckler bred animals and fewer dairy bred animals at the 5-star level after the changes have been implemented. And continental breeds will still dominate the representation of what the 5-star cows will be once these changes are implemented. So again, irrespective, I suppose, of your breed of choice, you know, where, you know, what's going to happen, I suppose, what's the direction of the suckler bred replacements? So again, we just kind of took a look, I suppose, of, you know, what are these changes going to mean on farm? And the very first thing, I suppose, the replacement index is looking, I suppose, for breeding the suckler cow of the future. So these changes will result in cows that are more fertile, slightly lighter, progeny that are easier calved, have a shorter gestation and less calf mortality, and also produce progeny that finish at an earlier age and require less feed to get to slaughter, which also have a better genetic resistance to TB. Those cows will also produce progeny that give slightly lighter and less conformed carcasses, but let's remember, the replacement index is designed to produce replacements or cows for the beef herd. So you'll be using the terminal bull to boost those carcass credentials when you're breeding animals that are destined for slaughter. The impact then, of course, on SCEP. So many of you will be signed up to SCEP. So you want to know, I suppose, well, what impact is this going to have for your herd? So look, the key message here is that basically most animals are not going to change. But of course, some animals will, and all farmers will need to check the status of their herd. For a small proportion of herds, it's going to be less than 5%, they will need to react, I suppose, down the line to meet these future SCEP targets. Now, we know we have Chris on the line as well, and he'll, going to go through some of the specific SCEP queries that are going to come in tonight. But for the majority of farmers, this isn't going to impact them at all. If we look at where 4 and 5 star cows are currently and see, okay, well, with these improved indexes, how are they going to change? 84% of those animals are still going to be 4 and 5 star after the changes are made. And of the animals that do change, so of the animals that will go down, an equal proportion of animals that fall from 4 and 5 star, an equal proportion of animals will also rise to 4 and 5 star. So in summary, these are not new indexes, they're simply just improved indexes to future-proof the industry, and Mags has mentioned that multiple times throughout the start. Most animals are not going to change, so if you need support, please contact Herd Plus, so that's the ICBF team, or your Teagasc advisor. There's going to be multiple events, I suppose, and media coverage over the next couple of weeks. So, for example, it was mentioned there about the Teagasc Beef Conference. There'll be information on Agriland, the Journal, and other media outlets throughout the next couple of weeks. So don't feel short of information. Do get in contact when you need more information. The second thing to remember is whatever your breed preference, that's okay. There is plenty of opportunity and scope for improvement within each individual breed. There are plenty of bulls that would be 4 and 5 star, irrespective of the breed you want to use. And these changes will help to improve all of the breeds. So when these changes will come into effect, it's in the next couple of weeks. So the date is the 21st of November. And the final thing is basically that this is not a whole rewrite of everything you know. It's simply just a couple of improvements to the indexes that you already know. So Pat, back to you, I think. You're on mute there again, Pat.
Thank you very much. Well done, Sean and Siobhan, and thank you very much. We're now going to move on to the second part of the evening, which is the question and answer sessions. But before doing so, I just want to thank the speakers on your behalf for what was 4 very comprehensive presentations, which I know from what I see before me here has raised a lot of questions. So to get matters underway, I'm going to start with the list. The first question, and this is addressed to Paul: what difference does carbon make to me? I don't get paid for it.
Okay, look, it's a really good question and a really important question, and it's something we discussed a lot before implementing it in the indexes, because the questioner is correct. At this point in time, we're not actually paid or charged for carbon, so that's a really important point. Look, there are a couple of elements to it. Firstly, we have already been moving in the direction of a more carbon efficient animal. So all of our traits are already moving us in that direction. So the point here is that we now have, I suppose, a social obligation, but also a legislative obligation to reduce carbon from all sectors of society. So this addition of carbon within the index is giving us a nudge in that direction, an additional nudge, if you like, in that direction. So giving us a little bit of increased momentum, I guess. The other point about it is that if you think about it, the last time we looked at these indexes and revised the economic values was 2015. That's 8 years ago. In 8 years' time, and in less than 8 years' time, there's a lot of discussion about things like carbon farming. There's a lot of discussion about the social license to farm and not the social license in any sector of society. So there will be changes in terms of how carbon is managed in society. So we don't know what the payment schedule will be. We don't know what the opportunities will be, but we need to future-proof our industry and future-proof our cow herd in terms of many different aspects, but carbon is a really, really important one.
Thank you, Paul. The next question, and this is addressed to Donna: as cows are getting smaller anyway, the current indexes align with carbon. Calving reports no major issues with docility or calving difficulty. Why are we doing this to ourselves?
So firstly, cow size is not actually decreasing, Pat. It's increasing slightly if we look at cull cow carcass weight by genetically, I think it's around 0.5 kilo per year. So what we're trying to do is try to stagnate that incline to make animals more efficient. And people shouldn't go away with the notion that, you know, we're looking for smaller cows, or is that the fact that we're trying to produce a quality animal without actually increasing the cow size appropriately, so that you're maintaining the maintenance requirements of the herd, the mature herd, which is like 65 to 85% of the costs actually goes into the mature herd. So you want to maintain that size while increasing your actual output. Calving difficulty is coming down now genetically, you're right. But it's coming down at, I think it's around a half, 0.05% every year. So I think we need to make that come down a little bit faster. But the point I made, Pat, was we don't look at genetic trends necessarily and come up with the economic values. It's the prices and the cost of production that decide what emphasis to put on these particular traits. If feed price goes up, the cost of maintaining the cow increases. So that actually puts a greater negative on that actual value. Same with docility. Labor costs are going up. Getting the vet out, if you can get him, is going up. The cost of infertility is going up. So that's where those values come from.
Okay. Thanks, Donna. The next question, and this is to Margaret or Siobhan. How can we increase the weighting on docility when we are not using the farmer-recorded docility scores for pedigree animals unless the pedigree animals have been linear scored?
I'm going to shoot that one, Pat, over to Ross, who's on the line as well with us tonight.
That's great. Thanks, Siobhan.
Yeah, Pat, just to answer that one. So there's a number of sources where docility comes from. It comes from the calf, the farmer scored calf docility, the cow docility, also scored by the farmer, but also then there's linear scored docility. So the current docility was implemented back about 5 or 6 years ago, when we had a lot of data coming from linear scoring. And that service isn't as predominant as it used to be. So we are looking at changing the entry criteria for some of the pedigree-based animals that are done with farmer, actually pedigree recorded from the farmer himself. So there are changes coming on those edits around the evaluation to reflect the different sources of data that are coming in now.
Very good. Very good. I have another question here, just inquiring about whether or not the session is being recorded, and I can confirm that the webinar is being recorded and will be up on both the Teagasc and ICBF websites. Another question for Donna here. I have 4 or 5 cows, 4 or 5 star cows down to 1 and 2 star cows. Yet every calf that they have has killed out U grades. Why are cows graded so low if producing quality calves?
Yeah, that's a good question, Pat. I often get so the first thing is, of course, cows only half the equation. But let's just assume that it's the same bull that is used across those particular cows, right, to equalize out the thing. And it comes back to my second last slide where I showed the relative emphasis. Half is the costs, right, and half is the revenue. So what you talked about there, Pat, was the revenue, and that's 100% right. Those animals, on average, should give you a lot of revenue. What you haven't talked about is the costs. Were they longer gestation, more difficult calving? Did they eat more? Did it take them longer to be slaughtered? So I would say, having been through the dairy 20 years ago, they were also focused on output and not focused on cost. And we changed that bracket around to make them a lot more profitable.
Excellent. Why are some heifer calves from 5-star cows only 2, 3 star, while others are 5 star? And can heifers with 3 stars gain stars? Again to Donna.
Yeah, there's another great question, Pat. And it's all to do with variability. Okay, you're talking about cows there. I often talk about sperm, right? But eggs, right? So the difference between the top one and bottom egg, right, in terminal index is probably around 120 euros. right? So you don't know. Let's take a bull, for example, right? The bull, whatever million number of sperm that they ejaculate, around 7 million of those will be 120 euros terminal index less than the other sperm. Actually, you don't know which one impregnates the cow. It could be one sperm one day and then the next one. Like, you could actually have twins, right? From a 3-star cow mated to a 3-star bull, you could have non-identical twins born. When you genotype them, one is a 1-star, one is a 5-star. That's like, look at your own family. Like, you're not identical. You're very similar, but you're not identical. It's a great question.
Excellent, yeah, genetic variation. This one for Margaret. Why wasn't this new evaluation system in place before the new scheme was launched?
Yeah, look, it's a great question. As you can see now, there was a lot of different things to review, a lot of things to change, and I did present a timeline, so hopefully that will help answer that question. We just simply were doing the research, it had to get reviewed, and it really only got approved in July. Then in July, the final approval. That meant, you know, we only run evaluations 6 times a year. They take 2 months to run each. That's why it's only 6 a year. So the first sight of these proofs all together, all these changes incorporated in together, were actually only available to us even at the end of September. So look, if we had it earlier, it's not like we were sitting on them or anything. It was literally, these are fresh off the press and straight out to industry after a serious amount of reviewing and sign off from our board.
So you brought it as soon as it was available to do so?
Exactly that, yeah.
Excellent. Another one, Margaret. Will the new evaluations be applied to all existing genotyped animals, or animals that are genotyped after November 21st?
That sounds like a bit of a skip question, but yeah, like, these changes will roll into all animals. And if it is to do with the skip, if the animal was 4 and 5-star on the old system, they will still qualify. That they are taken on board as well as the ones that will, with the new deadline on the 24th of November. So whichever hits the 4 or 5-star on either the old system, which is what we have currently, or what is proposed now for the 21st of November when they go live.
And another question, Margaret, you're very much in demand. The graph showed replacement index reducing from year 2000 to 2013. Why?
So again, yeah, just on that graph, the replacement index only actually came in 2011. So that graph might be small but confusing. That the line before then was kind of a retrospective look at what would the genetic trend have been, and that was the whole reason the replacement index came in, was that downward decline we saw prior to that. So when an index was available, you'll see on that graph, you go back over it in your own time. You'll see it maybe took about another 2 years before people started using the replacement index. It was a brand new index. They had always been focused on the terminal traits, and now this concept of breeding for the replacement side of the terminal traits was quite new at the time. And you see after about 2 years, then it just escalated, and BGP, of course, brought it into its own as well. And now it's on par with the terminal index in terms of people's focus on the breeding objectives for both terminal and replacement.
Excellent. And one for Donna. Are there certain beef breeds that are more resistant to TB?
There are, Pat, but talking about breeds has got me in hot water before, and I don't generally like talking about them. I think more we should be talking about the genetic evaluation. So Siobhan runs this genetic evaluation system, and what it does for individual animals, it gives them the likelihood of succumbing to TB if it was to exist within your herd. So I think, Siobhan, you can come in here. The average is 7%. Animals above it, like, I can name all the breeds, and you'll get one bull from every breed will be above it, and you know, one bull from every breed below it. The key here is not about breeds; it's about identifying the variability within the breeds. And on that, I know there's lots of discussion has been on about breeds, but the key point, Pat, to come out of this is there's lots of breeds on that list, and it's finding the best animal within those breeds is what this tool is really helping us to deliver on.
Excellent, excellent. And on the question, Donna, of docility, I have a question here. What percentage docility are they drawing the line for the extreme docility?
Yeah, so you would have seen it on my side. It's the halfway mark, Pat. It's below it is gets a relatively small benefit, and above it gets a larger penalty. But you don't tend to see real extreme animals. You seem to see more scores of 5. So it's halfway, Pat.
Very good. And this one for Paul. Can the new indices apply a negative weight to overproduction of milk by a cow? A calf under a single sucking system can only drink as much, and the excess is wasted energy on the cow's behalf. We want and need milk in the suckler cows, but not too much in a cow also. I think you made that point.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. So what the questioner is asking is essentially, do we include a non-linear aspect to the maternal weaning weight trait? At the present time, we don't, but we have reduced the emphasis, or we've reduced the economic value of that weaning weight trait. So we were previously at about 260, and now we're at 180. So we have reduced that emphasis, and as Siobhan showed, for example, the F1 crosses, the dairy crossbred origin suckler cows, the number of those fall out of the 4 and 5 star relative to the continental type animals. So there is slightly less emphasis on milk, and that will address that to some extent. But certainly in future developments of this, we certainly are interested in looking at non-linearity within a number of traits, because no trait is essentially linear. They all have non-linear aspects, but milk is certainly one that we'd be interested in. Donna mentioned it from a docility point of view. You could argue within calving difficulty and so on, and milk, very same point.
Okay, so excess would be regarded as a negative then?
Correct, yeah.
So this one for Chris. How will these changes impact on the current 4 and 5 stars 6 months into the suckler scheme?
So look, I think Mags alluded to it there earlier that, you know, animals that are already genotyped and deemed eligible in the suckler scheme will remain eligible. So like the changes will impact their current evaluations, but they will be deemed eligible based on previous evaluations. And that goes right back to, you know, the early years of BDGP. You know, there will be cows deemed eligible based on evaluations from 2016, 2017, 2018, etc. And they're carrying right through to SCEP, even though their current evaluations might be 2-star, 3-star. So those animals will remain eligible. Animals that haven't yet been genotyped, yes, you know, the changes may affect them. So some of them may drop, and some of them may have to qualify on the new evaluations. But ones who are already eligible will remain eligible.
Okay. And to Paul, should pole bulls not have an impact on terminal and replacement figures? Huge impact on labour and animal welfare, issue removed through pole.
Yeah, and the answer is they are. So pollardness is a trait within the indexes, and there are economic values for that. So it is an important trait, and it is in the indexes.
Okay. And to Siobhan, when will the updated index as described here go live on ICBF?
So less than 3 weeks away, Pat. So it's the 21st of November. It's a Tuesday. Within 3 weeks, and then all the information for each individual purge will be there.
Okay. This is one for Donna again relating to polled bulls. Should polled bulls not have an impact on terminal and replacement figures? Oh, sorry, that's a repetition. I think you've answered that, Paul. Where is the ICBF methane research fitting into the terminal and maternal figures? Surely the breeds that are proven to have lower emissions should be rewarded. Are they? And if not, why? Donna and Paul.
Yeah, so I can take that. So what we did is we released preliminary or test evaluations last year. They're based on an indoor feeding system. What we're exploring now at the moment is how they relate to methane in a grazed pasture system. And that's when, if they relate well to each other, then we can look at incorporating them within the terminal index.
Okay.
And replacement.
Are the existing, next question, are the Eurostar indexes going to be updated automatically on existing herd, or just going forward for new animals born? To Chris.
So I think they're maybe half touching on the SCEP there. So again, the animals that are already eligible in genotype will remain eligible. Like the new changes will affect all animals, you know, current animals in herds, and even the indexes of AI bulls or stock bulls that are maybe long dead. All animals are going to be updated. The figures will change. So in relation to the scheme, as I said, if they are already genotyped, they'll be eligible for it. Animals going forward, if they're genotyped, let's say from the start of January 2024 onwards, they would have to become eligible on the updated evaluations.
Thanks, Chris. And just another query here from a member of the audience in relation to these presentations. These presentations will be made available on the Teagasc website early next week. Okay. Why is the value, next question, why is the value of weaning weight reduced? Surely higher weaning weight is better, to Paul.
Yeah, and it is better. So it has been reduced slightly or somewhat since the last iteration of the economic values, but it's still positive. So it is still, you're still incentivized to produce heavier weanlings. So we have a value now of almost 180 for weaning weight. If we take, for example, the weaning values in the MarkWatch pages today, average weaning value is 230. So, and there is a cost to producing that weaning. We have to accept there's some cost in there. So the actual per kilo economic value for weaning weight now is 180. So I mean, there is still an incentive and a positive economic value for weaning weight. The question is how that relates to other economic values. Other economic values have increased and that has decreased slightly. So the emphasis is slightly lower, but it is still incentivized to produce heavier weanlings, and it is still a positive value.
And next question to Donna. Thanks, Paul. How is the TB trait calculated?
Actually, Siobhan's in a better place to do that. She runs it.
Yeah, so look, we take all the information from the vets and from the factory. So that's the skin tests and the annual herd skin test, as well as all the factory lesion data. That all feeds into the ICBF database for the last 10-12 years. It's the exact same principle as any other evaluation that we have. So we have the pedigree information and we have the phenotype data, and we can link up, I suppose, the animals that are going down either in the factory or on the herd test, and that's allowing us then to predict the genetic merit on these animals. We'll say who may not necessarily have that TB data for themselves. They're still young animals.
Thanks, Siobhan. This is a question to Paul. For docility, you are using a non-linear scale. Have you adopted a similar strategy in terms of milkability? Does the index increase up to a point and then reduce after it reaches the optimum level? I think this method would help to level the playing field in terms of dairy bred replacements versus beef breeds, and thus alleviate some of the concerns farmers have had in the past.
Yeah, and look, it's similar to one of the previous questions around non-linearity in milk yield. So the milk yield trait, or the maternal weaning weight trait, has reduced slightly. Siobhan put up the numbers in terms of the cows, and the number of cows, the F1 dairy crossbred beef suckler cows, have reduced. The numbers that fall into the 4 and 5 star. So you are seeing an effect of that reduced weaning weight value on the F1 crosses. What I will say is that it is a really valid point, and it is something that, in future evaluations or future updates of this, that we will look at, because certainly the non-linear effect on milk yield, both at the lower end, there's a low end when it becomes really drastically problematic, equally at the upper end in terms of high milk yield where it becomes problematic. So it is a very valid point. The issue here is around data access and then analysing that data and implementing the economic values. But certainly it's a valid point and one that needs to be looked at.
Thanks, Bob. And the next question to Siobhan. Has docility disappeared from replacement index? Surely it is important in the suckler cow.
No, absolutely not. Docility is in both the terminal and replacement index. So it's coming into effect the way Donna mentioned there, in that it's non-linear. So those really aggressive animals are kind of being penalised harder. So it's definitely still included, Pat, within both indexes.
Very good. Good for that confirmation. And this one to Paul in relation to a weaning farmer in Skep. I'm a suckler to weaning farmer in Skep. why am I being pushed to produce calves with a lower weaning weight? It is clear that the quality Charolais calves are the only calves getting a proper market price.
Yeah, okay. So I mean, it's similar to one of the previous questions, and it's really important to say that the economic value for weaning weight is still very positive. It's one of our most important positive weaning or positive output traits. So we have 3 output traits: carcass weight, cull weight, and weaning weight. So these are really important traits that remain within the index and that remain very positive. So they're counteracting the cost traits. We have cost traits and we have revenue traits. So we're trying to get a balance of both. So the revenue trait and on the maternal weaning weight, as I mentioned, is 180. So it's still a really important trait within the index, and there still is emphasis to increase weaning weights within the index.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. To Siobhan, when will the reports come out to show what our herd is evaluated at?
Again, that will be 3 weeks' time, Pat, the 21st of November, so that's the key date.
Excellent. And to Margaret, when will the improved indexes be published?
Yeah, so that's the 21st of November. That's when you'll see them online. I suppose some people are more familiar with getting stuff posted out to them, so it'll be a few days after that. But it will be online from the 21st.
Okay, this is a question in relation to young bulls to Donna. If age of slaughter is so important, why aren't young bull breeds coming to the fore?
So if that's in relation to growing bulls, so what we don't do is we don't compare bulls to steers. You can't do that. That's nonsensical to do that. You compare bulls to bulls, you compare steers to steers, you compare heifers to heifers, and you compare one farm to itself. You never compare farms against each other. And people, I'm sure, they have plenty of times they've told me about this particular animal and it graded E or it had a particular carcass weight, but some of that is actually due to management and some of it is due to genetics, right? So you can only compare an animal's performance to its own herd mates. You don't compare it to other farms.
Okay. So that's the whole basis of the comparison.
Contemporary comparison.
Key terms of the index change from the current format on ICBF and how it's presented to farmers to see, to Margaret.
Yeah, so again, that beef focus group there in October, we went through a day of it, going through what it should look like. So we went through what you'd see on the animal search. You know, they came up with ideas in terms of what should be displayed, should be more trays, should be scrolls. So yeah, those specs that were designed from the group were brought back here to ICBF then, and we have a whole project team now working on it. So it won't change hugely, but definitely, you know, with the addition of new traits, you know, there was questions around should age of finish be displayed on the front page. But you will see everything more or less in a uniformed the way you know it now, just with a few additional traits shown.
Thanks, Margaret. This is a question to Paul. Why does gestation length matter as we are not selling milk to the creamery?
Okay, yeah, so there are a number of components to gestation, and it's predominantly a cost trait within the beef indexes. So if you take the extremes, so let's say an extreme 10-day difference in gestation length, we take the revenue side first. So you have a fixed weaning date, so the weather breaks, or you have a part of the country where you wean on a fixed date of your system. So for a 10-day difference in gestation length, you have a 10-day difference in age at weaning. So your longer gestation length progeny, so the progeny that are produced from the longer gestation length pregnancy, is 10 days younger, 10 days later. That 10-day difference is carried through to slaughter. Okay, so that is a 10-day difference in terms of slaughter weight in that system. The second part of it is that where you have a gestation length that's longer, your cow remains inside for that duration. So cows typically spring calving system inside until calving. So you have 10 days on a grass silage diet, as opposed to the comrade animal that's outside grazing pasture, suckling a calf. So there are cost elements to it, and there is a revenue element to it. Final piece is replacement rate. Where gestation length increases within a fixed breeding season, you have a shorter duration that the cow is exposed or available for breeding. Therefore, your replacement rate increases very, very slightly, but there is an increase in replacement rate. So those 3 components still important within the gestation length trait for suckling systems.
Thanks, Paul. And this is a question for Donna. will the less emphasis on fertility not lead to longer calving periods?
I don't believe so, Pat. And this is a little bit like the weaning weight comments that has come up, I think, 2 or 3 times that Paul has answered. Like, it's not that we're selecting against weaning weight or we're selecting against fertility. We are still trying to improve both of them, but just like the maximum amount of emphasis you can have is 100%. So if you put something into an index, it must come from something. Even the economic value, I can't remember, Paul, but I think the economic value in calving interval has actually gotten stronger. So it's just, it all has to squash into 100%. And we're still trying, it's a really important point. We're still increasing weaning weight. That's what we're still trying to strive to do, right? And we're still striving to improve fertility and survival and all the traits. And there's a lot of comments coming in about the output traits, and that's fine, but output is only half of the equation, right? We're price takers. So if we want to maintain a profit margin, one of the things that's really under our control is the cost of production. So I would urge people to not always just focus on the mart price and the carcass price. Think about the cost it took to get you there in the first place, like fertility.
Yes.
And just on the calving, sorry, Pat, on the calving interval trait, so it has increased quite considerably. So it's gone from 220 to about 360 or 350 or something in that order. So I don't have the exact figure, but there has been quite an increase in terms of the cost for calving interval.
Yeah, because the aim here is to leave a profit margin for the herd owner.
Right.
Yes.
Correct.
So, why is carbon being weighed the same as milk in the replacement index? Surely this isn't in the farmer's interest and will lower carcass weights and weaning weights.
So why is carbon price? So just to explain maybe the
in the milk as milk in the replacement index.
Okay, so just to explain how the carbon values are calculated. Each trait we get an emissions cost for those traits. So if it's milk, for example, there's a cost of additional feed. That's a carbon cost. If it's gestation length, or calving interval, the last two that we spoke about, there's a feed effect. So they're longer indoors on a grass silage diet, and there's higher emissions from grass silage diets relative to grass pasture. So regardless of the trait effect, there is an impact on emissions. What we do then is convert that into an economic value by using an 80 euros per ton cost for carbon. So carbon, if you're in the emissions trading scheme, or if you're in a grey market for carbon, there is a value for carbon regardless of how that carbon is generated. So we apply that cost to the total carbon that's being generated.
Okay. To Margaret, thanks, Paul. Are you encouraging AI stations to release new catalogues with new figures after the changes?
So yeah, as I said earlier, there's 6 evaluations a year, so it's in their best interest to always display the most up to date. We only ever publish one version of the truth, so it's up to them obviously. But from the 21st of November, that's when the new proofs are out. So if they want the most accurate figures, that's what they should do.
Okay, I just skipped one there, an error there, and this one is a question. Back to the question asked about how heifer calves out of 5-star cows can be 2-star and some 5-star when using the same bull. And the answer given was that the variation that can be seen when using the same bull is down to which sperm is used. Elaborate on this.
Well, like inside an ejaculate from sperm, there's absolutely millions of different, or ejaculate of semen, there's millions of different sperm. Each of those have half of the DNA of the bull, but it's a random half. So you could have 2 sperms that are completely and utterly non-identical. They share no DNA, even though they came from exactly the same ejaculate from exactly the same bull. That is just biology.
Okay, that's a fair point. There's a second element to this. How can ICBF give varied star ratings to calves out of the same bull by guessing which sperm it was?
Yeah, that's a good one. So they can't. So when the calves are born, they'll get exactly the same evaluation, which is just simply half the sire plus half the dam. That's what everything, sheep, dairy, goats, doesn't make a difference. It's when you genotype them, then you realize what the DNA inside in that sperm cell actually was.
Yes, and the final element of that, Donna, if the bull used is a 5-star genotype bull, how can ICBF then decide the star rating given to the calves depends which sperm, no, that you've already explained that, I think. Yeah. If the bull is used as a 5-star genus, how can ICBF then decide the star rating given to the calves depends on sperm it is, given the, okay, I think you've answered that. Okay, moving on, have we reduced the emphasis on weight for age in the new figures? Donna?
No, quite on the contrary, actually. So what we've done is we've increased the economic value on carcass weight. Paul's gone up around 60 cents a kilo, I think. So that's increasing carcass weight. And then on the opposite side, we're trying to pull back age to slaughter. So it's actually done the opposite. So what, and this is the thing, I hate those relative emphasis graphs because sometimes they're for exactly this exact question, you might see less emphasis on carcass weight, but what you didn't see was a 7% emphasis on age at slaughter. So carcass weight per age has got a greater emphasis.
Okay. And to Chris, thanks, Donna. If a cow is 4 or 5-star rated under old rating, but drops under the new rating, will the cow continue to be regarded as 4 or 5 for the 5-year duration of SEP?
Yeah, so I guess again this is one related to eligibility for the suckler scheme, the SCEP scheme. So yes, if the animal has already been deemed eligible, i.e. genotyped 4 or 5-star, regardless of where the figures go after that, the animal, the cow, the female, will remain eligible in that herd.
Hello? Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you, Pat.
Okay, sorry, sorry, it's finished. Yeah, no, I just went dead there. Okay.
Everybody else hear that, yeah?
Yeah.
Will every farmer get a copy of posted out to them to Margaret?
If you get reports from ICBF, they'll be posted out after the evaluation, but it's not, that'll be a few days after publication. But yeah, if you want to get them as soon as possible, 21st of November online is where you get them.
Okay. And to Siobhan, will sorry, where am I here now? Will all the existing information on genomics be available on individual animals on the ICBF website?
So, okay, back to that, Pat, I suppose, look, just to remind people, like, this is not a whole rewrite of the overall index. It's not a whole rewrite of everything that they know and have seen before. So everything that's on the website is pretty much going to look very much the same. It's just an improvement to the indexes. So anything that was there before is going to be there from the 21st of November as well.
Very good, very good. There's somebody making a comment here to say that so some sperms are 5 and others are 2 stars. Is the whole trait then based on luck?
Well, I'll have to give a talk on this someday. Yes, that's breeding. If we were so bloody good, we'd be exporting bulls around the world. It is a looks game. It is analogous to horse racing. Okay. Well, there's some people make a very good job of the horse racing and others don't, and I suppose that's the challenge. First of all, folks, I think that brings us to the end of the questions now as presented here. And I think it's time to wrap up. But before concluding, I first of all want to acknowledge the great participation by the audience here this evening with the excellent range of questions. I again want to thank the speakers for the excellent presentation and the comprehensive answers provided to the questions raised. I also want to remind you, the audience, that the National Beef Conference has been held this year in Ballinasloe on the 21st of November, and Paul Crossan is also speaking at that conference. So it remains for me to thank you, the audience, for your great participation here and in making it what was, I feel, was a very useful evening for all concerned. So thank you to all, and good night. Thanks, Pat.
Thank you.
All right.